The great council chamber of Zephyria hung suspended between three crimson moons, its crystalline walls catching and fracturing the light into thousands of dancing rainbows. Ambassador Lyrelii of the Vorthak Empire stood before the assembled representatives of 12 galactic civilizations, her scaled hands trembling as she held the treaty that would either save or damn her people. The war had raged for 3 standard cycles now. The Kethmori Syndicate, those insectoid warmongers from the outer spiral, had pushed deep into Vorthak territory. Their bioships consumed planets like locusts, leaving nothing but barren rock in their wake. Lyrelii's homeworld of Thesha Prime had fallen 2 months ago. The refugee camps on the outer colonies were overflowing, and their military was in full retreat. The terms are simple, droned High Magistrate Veltar of the Galactic Mediation Board, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence as he read from the holographic display. The Kethmori will cease all hostilities against the Vorthak Empire in exchange for one condition. He paused, his mantis-like head tilting toward Lyrelii. A marriage bond between their war queen Zixandra and a member of your royal bloodline. Lyrelii's blood ran cold. She was the last of the royal line, the only surviving member of the Theshan dynasty. Her parents, her siblings, even her young nephew had all perished when the Kethmori glass-bombed the palace. The weight of her entire civilization rested on her shoulders. I accept, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But High Magistrate Veltar held up one clawed hand. There is a complication. War Queen Zixandra has rejected the proposal. She claims that bonding with what she calls prey-weak Vorthak royalty would be beneath her station. She demands a warrior mate worthy of her strength. The chamber erupted in murmurs and clicks from the various alien delegates. Lyrelii felt her hope crashing down around her like the towers of her ancestral home. However, Veltar continued, his voice cutting through the noise. There is an alternative proposal. The Terran representative has offered a substitute. A shocked silence fell over the chamber. The humans were the newest members of the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. They were considered a curiosity at best, primitives who had somehow stumbled upon the secrets of the universe through brute force rather than enlightened evolution. From the far corner of the chamber, a figure in simple brown clothing stood up. Ambassador Marcus Chun looked unremarkable compared to the exotic aliens surrounding him. No scales, no additional limbs, no bioluminescent markings. Just a middle-aged human with graying hair and tired eyes. The Terran Coalition offers one of our own as a marriage partner for War Queen Zixandra, Marcus said calmly. In exchange for this sacrifice, we ask only that the Vorthak Empire consider a mutual defense pact with Earth. Lyrelii stared at the human in disbelief. The humans wanted to save her people? But why? They barely knew each other existed. Earth was a small, backwater world with a single planet and a handful of orbital stations. What could they possibly gain from this arrangement? Who would you offer? Demanded Veltar. Colonel James Harrison, Marcus replied. A decorated war veteran and tactical specialist. The chamber buzzed with conversation. Lyrelii had never heard of this human, but the other delegates seemed to be discussing something in hushed tones. She caught fragments of their whispered conversations. The ones from the Proxima incident. Didn't they hold off an entire Raxtheri fleet with 3 ships? Impossible. The reports must have been exaggerated. High Magistrate Veltar raised his hand for silence. War Queen Zixandra will need to approve this candidate personally. We will arrange a meeting. 3 days later, Lyrelii found herself aboard the neutral station Harmony's Edge, waiting in a sterile conference room for the War Queen's arrival. The human, Colonel Harrison, sat across from her, and she couldn't help but study him with growing confusion. He looked ordinary. Average height, brown hair, weathered skin that spoke of times spent under harsh suns. His uniform was simple military dress, no elaborate decorations or intimidating modifications. She'd expected someone larger, more imposing. The Kethmori respected only strength and martial prowess. Forgive me, Colonel, she said carefully, but I must ask, why are your people doing this? What do humans gain from this arrangement? Harrison looked up from the data pad he'd been reading. His eyes were a warm brown, but she could see something harder underneath, like steel wrapped in velvet. Honestly, because it's the right thing to do, he said. Your people are dying. If my marriage to this war queen can stop that, then it's a small price to pay. Small price. Lyrelii's scales flushed blue with incredulity. You're agreeing to bond with one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. Kethmori queens have been known to devour their mates during the bonding ritual, if they prove unsatisfactory. Harrison's expression didn't change. I've read the files. Before Lyralii could respond, the station's atmosphere processors whined to accommodate a new environmental setting. The air grew thick and humid, filled with the sharp scent of pheromones and ozone. The lights dimmed to a reddish hue. War Queen Zixandra had arrived. The Kethmori ruler stood nearly 3 meters tall, her chitinous exoskeleton gleaming like black diamond. 6 limbs moved with predatory grace, for locomotion, and 2 massive claws that could shear through battleship armor. Her compound eyes reflected the red light like fractured mirrors, and, when she spoke, it was with the voice of 1,000 hornets. So, she buzzed, her head swiveling to focus on Harrison. This is the offering. The small soft thing that thinks it can bond with Zixandra of the deep hives. Harrison stood slowly and gave a respectful nod. Your Majesty, I'm Colonel James Harrison. Zixandra circled him like a predator sizing up prey. Her claws clicked against the metal deck plates, and Lyralii could see acid dripping from her mandibles. This was going to end in bloodshed. You are pathetically small, the War Queen observed. No carapace, no natural weapons. Your species has been in the void for what, 50 of your short years? My people have conquered star systems while yours were still crawling in the mud. That's true, Harrison agreed calmly. You show no fear. Interesting. Zixandra leaned down until her massive head was inches from Harrison's face. Tell me, small soft thing, what makes you worthy to be the mate of a hive queen? What victories have you won? What enemies have you crushed beneath your feet? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, and Lyralii held her breath. Then he spoke, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. 3 years ago, a Raxtheri battle fleet attacked our colony on Proxima Centauri. 47 ships, including 3 of their Cathedral-class dreadnoughts. I was in command of the defense force, 2 destroyers, and a retrofitted cargo hauler. Zixandra's compound eyes glittered with interest. And we won. The War Queen's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of either amusement or agitation. Impossible. The Raxtheri are the finest void warriors in 3 sectors. Their cathedral ships can crack a moon in half. Yes, they can, Harrison agreed. That's why we didn't fight them ship to ship. We fought them like humans fight. Something in his tone made Lyralii's scales prickle with unease. There was a darkness there, a depth she hadn't noticed before. Explain, demanded Zixandra. Harrison clasped his hands behind his back, his posture shifting slightly. To Lyralii's trained eye, he suddenly looked less like a diplomat and more like what he truly was, a soldier. The Raxtheri are honorable warriors. They follow codes of conduct, rules of engagement. They announce their presence, they demand surrender, they give civilians time to evacuate. They fight like knights. Harrison's smile was thin and sharp. Humans aren't knights, Your Majesty. We're survivors. He began to pace, and Lyralii noticed that even his movements had changed. There was something predatory about the way he moved now, something that reminded her uncomfortably of the War Queen herself. We didn't announce ourselves. We didn't demand surrender. While the Raxtheri were setting up their siege formation and broadcasting their terms, we were already moving. My cargo hauler, the Beagle, had been retrofitted with a mining laser array, the kind used for asteroid processing. Not much use in a ship-to-ship battle, but perfect for what we had in mind. Zixandra had gone completely still, her attention focused entirely on the human. We waited until their fleet was in perfect formation, all bunched together like they teach in their war academies. Then, the Beagle jumped in at point-blank range and opened fire, not at their ships, but at the massive asteroid field they were using for cover. Lyralii felt a chill run down her spine as understanding dawned. We turned 100 billion tons of rock into shrapnel moving at relativistic speeds. The Raxtheri fleet was shredded before they knew what hit them. Those cathedral ships you mentioned? They're designed to fight other ships, not to defend against a debris field moving at 20% light speed. The conference room had gone dead silent except for the soft hum of the life support systems. 47 ships destroyed. 12,000 Raxtheri warriors dead. The entire Proxima system saved. Harrison's voice was flat, emotionless. Total human casualties, 0. War Queen Zixandra's claws extended slowly, scraping against the deck plates. But, instead of attacking, she began to emit a low, thrumming sound from deep within her thorax. It took Lyralii a moment to realize the War Queen was purring. Clever, Zixandra buzzed. Ruthless. You fight without honor, without mercy. You use the enemy's expectations against them. Her massive head tilted. I begin to see why the other species speak of your kind in whispers. Harrison shrugged. We do what we have to do to protect our own. And yet you offer yourself to save these Vorthack prey things. Why? Because sometimes the right thing and the smart thing are the same thing. The Kethmori are expanding toward human space. If we let you consume the Vorthack, we'll be next. Better to stop you here, with allies, than face you alone later. The War Queen's purring grew louder. Truth. You speak truth, Soft-Thing Harrison. You would sacrifice yourself not for glory or honor, but for cold calculation. This pleases me greatly. She reared back to her full height, her voice booming through the chamber. I accept this bonding. The human will be my mate warrior, and the Kethmori will cease hostilities against the Vorthack. Her compound eyes fixed on Harrison with something that might have been approval. Perhaps you are not so soft after all, small thing. As the War Queen swept out of the chamber, followed by her buzzing retinue, Lyralii remained frozen in her seat. The human had done it. He'd somehow convinced the most dangerous predator in the galaxy to marry him. Her people were saved. But, as she looked at Colonel Harrison, who was calmly gathering his data pads as if he'd just negotiated a trade agreement instead of his own potential death sentence, she found herself wondering if the Kethmori knew what they were really getting themselves into. The human had spoken of turning asteroids into weapons, of fighting without honor or mercy. He'd described the annihilation of 12,000 warriors with the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. And he'd done it all to save a people he'd never met, not out of nobility, but out of cold, calculated pragmatism. For the first time since the war began, Lyralii felt a flicker of something other than despair. But it wasn't exactly hope that warmed her scales. It was something darker, something that whispered that perhaps the Kethmori weren't the most dangerous predators in the galaxy after all. Perhaps they were about to find out what it really meant to tangle with humanity. The bonding ceremony was scheduled for the following week. As Lyralii made her way back to her quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy was about to change in ways no one could predict. The humans had entered the galactic stage quietly, almost apologetically. But now she wondered if that had been an act, a mask worn by creatures who understood that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one that didn't look dangerous at all. She thought about the way Harrison had described the Proxima battle, the casual efficiency with which he'd planned the deaths of thousands. And yet he'd volunteered to marry a Kethmori war queen to save her people he'd never met. What kind of species produced individuals like that? What kind of evolution created beings capable of such calculated brutality wrapped in such apparent compassion? As she sealed her quarters behind her, Lyralii realized she was about to find out. The marriage would bring the humans closer to galactic politics, give them a foothold in the greater community of species. She wondered if the other races realized what they'd just invited into their midst. Or if, like the Raxtheri admiral who died at Proxima, they were about to discover that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their complete willingness to do whatever it took to win. The bonding ceremony took place on Kethmori Prime, deep within the labyrinthine hive cities that honeycombed the planet's crust. Lyralii had never seen anything like it in her life. Massive chambers carved from living rocks stretched for kilometers, their walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that served as both art and communication. The air thrummed with the constant vibration of billions of wings, and the scent of pheromones was so thick it was almost visible. She stood in the observation gallery alongside representatives from a dozen species, all watching as Colonel Harrison walked calmly through corridors that would have sent most sentient beings fleeing in terror. The human seemed completely unaffected by the alien environment, his expression calm and alert as warrior drones the size of shuttlecraft escorted him deeper into the hive. He shows no fear, murmured Ambassador Krell of the Cinderin Republic, his crystalline form chiming softly with each word. Either he is remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Perhaps both, Lyralii replied, watching Harrison disappear around a curve in the tunnel system. She'd spent the past week studying human history and culture, trying to understand the species that had saved her people. What she discovered had left her deeply unsettled. Humans were barely out of their technological infancy, yet their military records were filled with impossible victories against overwhelming odds. They'd fought wars against themselves that made the current Kethmori conflict look like a border skirmish. They developed weapons capable of sterilizing their own planet multiple times over, then somehow managed to step back from the brink of self-destruction and reach for the stars. But it was their mythology that truly disturbed her. Every human culture had stories of individuals who sacrificed everything for the greater good, who walked willingly into certain death for abstract concepts like honor and duty. They called them heroes, and they worshipped them. What kind of species created legends around self-destruction? Deep within the hive, Harrison found himself in the Queen's chamber, a vast cathedral-like space where bioluminescent streams flowed down the walls like frozen lightning. War Queen Zixandra waited at the center, surrounded by her honor guard of elite warrior drones. Each of the drones was twice Harrison's size, and armed with natural weapons that could tear through battle armor. "You came," Zixandra buzzed, sounding almost surprised. "Many mates have fled before reaching this depth." "I gave my word," Harrison replied simply. The War Queen's compound eyes studied him with what might have been approval. "Indeed, the bonding ritual of my people is not like the gentle ceremonies of other species. It is a test of worthiness, a trial by combat that proves the mate's fitness to stand beside a queen." "I understand. Do you?" Zixandra's claws scraped against the chamber floor. "The last 17 beings who attempted to bond with me died in this chamber. Their bones still line the walls as decoration and warning." Harrison looked around the chamber and noticed for the first time the pale formations jutting from the walls. They weren't rock formations after all. He nodded calmly. "I see them. And still you do not flee." "No." The War Queen's mandibles clicked rapidly. "Then, let us begin. The ritual is simple. You must survive one full cycle while I hunt you through the deep chambers. If you live until the hunting horn sounds, the bond will be sealed. If you die—" She gestured with one claw toward the bone-decorated walls. "What are the rules of engagement?" Harrison asked. Zixandra's laugh was like breaking glass. "There are no rules, soft thing Harrison. There is only survival." A low horn sounded from somewhere deep in the hive, its mournful note echoing through the passages. Zixandra's eyes glowed with predatory anticipation. "Run," she whispered. Harrison didn't run. Instead, he walked calmly toward one of the chamber's several exit tunnels, his pace steady and measured. Behind him, he could hear the War Queen's frustrated clicking. "You do not flee like prey," she called after him. Interesting. Harrison disappeared into the tunnel system, and Zixandra waited exactly 60 seconds before beginning her hunt. This was her domain, carved and shaped by countless generations of her ancestors. Every tunnel, every chamber, every passage was known to her. No outsider had ever successfully navigated the deep chambers without her permission. But, as she began to track her prey, Zixandra found herself facing something she'd never encountered before. The human's scent trail didn't follow any logical pattern. Instead of seeking higher ground or more defensible positions, he seemed to be moving deeper into the hive, into areas even she rarely visited. More disturbing still, she began to find signs that he'd been modifying things. A support beam had been carefully weakened with what looked like precise acid burns. A ventilation shaft had been partially blocked with debris. Several bioluminescent panels had been systematically damaged, creating pockets of absolute darkness in the tunnels. The War Queen paused in her hunt, a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades creeping up her spine. Uncertainty. The human wasn't running from her. He was preparing for her. In the observation gallery, the assembled delegates watched in fascination as multiple view screens showed different areas of the deep chambers. Most tracking devices couldn't penetrate the dense rock and organic matter of the hive, but the Kethmori had provided limited access to their internal monitoring systems. "I've lost his signal," announced technical operator Vex High, his multiple hands dancing over the control interface. "The human has entered a section of the deep chambers that we do not actively monitor." "Why not?" asked Ambassador Krell. "Because nothing that enters those areas ever returns," Vex High replied matter-of-factly. "They are the forgotten deeps, chambers carved during the ancient wars, and then sealed when they became too dangerous even for our warriors." Lyrelii felt her blood chill. "And Harrison went there voluntarily?" "It would appear so." Ambassador Marcus Chun, who had remained silent during most of the ceremony, finally spoke up. "Operator, can you show us the War Queen's position?" Vex High manipulated the controls, and one screen lit up with the massive form of Zixandra as she moved through the tunnels with deadly grace. Her movements were hypnotic, each step calculated for maximum silence and efficiency. "She's heading toward the same area," Chen observed. His expression was calm, but Lyrelii noticed his hands were clenched into fists. "Your colonel is leading her into the forgotten deeps," Vex High said. "Either he is more clever than any prey we have ever encountered, or he is about to become the fastest casualty in bonding history." James doesn't do anything without a reason, Chen replied quietly. Deep in the forgotten deeps, Harrison moved through chambers that hadn't seen active use in centuries. The walls here were different from the upper levels, scarred with ancient blast marks and strange corrosion patterns. The air was thinner, filled with the scent of old battles and older deaths. He'd spent the past week studying every technical manual and historical document the Kethmori had been willing to share. Most species would have focused on the cultural aspects of the bonding ritual, but Harrison had been more interested in the engineering schematics of the hive city itself. The Forgotten Deeps weren't forgotten at all. They were a testament to the Kethmori's military past, chambers that had been sealed not because they were dangerous, but because they contained evidence of defeats that the proud warrior species preferred not to remember. Harrison found what he was looking for in a chamber that had once been a command center. Ancient monitoring stations lined the walls, their screens dark and lifeless. But the power conduits were still active, still feeding energy to systems that hadn't been used in generations. He began to work. Zixandra reached the entrance to the Forgotten Deeps and paused. Her praise-scent trail led directly into the sealed passages, which shouldn't have been possible. The barriers here were designed to keep even the most determined intruders out. But the barriers had been opened from the inside, using access codes that predated her own reign, codes that should have been lost to history. The War Queen's compound eyes glowed with a mixture of anger and grudging admiration. The human had somehow acquired historical records that her own people had tried to bury. He'd studied them, understood them, and used them to gain access to areas that were meant to remain sealed forever. Clever little soft thing, she murmured, and entered the Forgotten Deeps. The chambers here brought back memories she'd tried to suppress. This was where her great-grandmother's forces had made their last stand against the Void Wraiths, creatures from dark space that consumed matter and energy with equal hunger. The Kethmori had won that war, but at a cost so terrible that all records of it had been classified beyond the highest security levels. Zixandra moved more cautiously now, her warrior instincts screaming warnings. Something was wrong. The human scent was everywhere, but it was too strong, too dispersed, as if he'd been moving through these chambers for hours instead of minutes. That was when she realized the truth. The bonding ritual had been a distraction. While she'd been preparing for a traditional hunt, the human had been preparing for war. The lights went out. Emergency illumination kicked in a moment later, but it was too late. In those few seconds of absolute darkness, Harrison had moved. Zixandra spun around, trying to locate him, but her echolocation was being disrupted by some kind of interference. Impressive, she called out, her voice echoing off the chamber walls. You have studied our weaknesses. But you cannot hide forever, soft thing. I'm not hiding. Harrison's voice came from everywhere at once, amplified and distorted by the chamber's acoustic properties. I'm hunting. The War Queen's mandibles clicked in confusion. Prey didn't hunt predators. It was contrary to the natural order, contrary to everything she understood about the universe. But even as that thought crossed her mind, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the sharp sting of actually being hunted by something that might be dangerous. A section of the floor collapsed beneath her rear legs, dropping her into a pit that shouldn't have existed. As she struggled to regain her footing, she realized the human had been busy during his time in the Forgotten Deeps. He'd used the ancient mining charges stored in the lower levels to reshape the chamber itself. You fight like prey, Harrison's amplified voice echoed around her. You rely on superior size and natural weapons. You announce your presence and challenge your enemies to face you directly. Zixandra hauled herself out of the pit, her exoskeleton scraped but not seriously damaged. And how do you fight, human? Like something that evolved on a death world. The chamber's ancient defense systems suddenly came online, weapon turrets that hadn't fired in centuries swiveling to track movement. But they weren't targeting the human. They were targeting her. Zixandra dove for cover as particle beams sizzled through the air where she'd been standing. The human had somehow managed to reactivate and reprogram military hardware that had been offline longer than most species had been spacefaring. Earth isn't the garden world you think it is, Harrison's voice continued as the War Queen dodged another barrage of weapons fire. It's tried to kill us every day for 4 million years. Ice ages that lasted millennia. Supervolcanic eruptions that blotted out the sun. Asteroid impacts that wiped out 90% of all life. A massive explosion rocked the chamber as one of the defense turrets overloaded and detonated. Zixandra used the chaos to move to a new position, but the human seemed to anticipate her movements. Every path she took led her deeper into his prepared killing ground. We learned to survive by being smarter, more adaptable, more ruthless than anything trying to eat us. We learned to turn our environment into a weapon. We learned to make our enemies' strengths into their weaknesses. Another section of floor collapsed, this one revealing a pool of the acid that the ancient Kethmori had used to dissolve their enemies. Zixandra barely managed to avoid falling into it, and, as she landed hard against the chamber wall, she found herself facing a terrible realization. She was losing, not just the hunt, but the entire psychological framework that had defined her existence. She was the apex predator, the ultimate warrior, the queen of a species that had conquered half a spiral arm. She did not get outmaneuvered by soft little mammals who'd barely learned to leave their homeworld. But the evidence was impossible to deny. The human had studied her people's history better than she had. He'd turned her own hive against her. He'd made her environment his ally, and her strengths into liabilities. The Void Wraiths, Harrison's voice said, and Zixandra went completely still. Your great-grandmother fought them here. They were creatures of living darkness that consumed matter and energy. Unstoppable. Inevitable. Until your ancestors figured out how to make them fight each other instead of the Kethmori. How could he possibly know about that? The records had been buried so deep that even she'd only learned about them when she inherited the throne. They turned the Wraiths' feeding instincts against them, set traps that made the creatures attack their own kind, used their hunger as a weapon. Harrison's voice was coming from a different direction now, but Zixandra no longer trusted her senses. Humans learned the same lessons, but we learned them from our planet instead of our enemies. The hunting horn sounded in the distance, its mournful note echoing through the deep chambers. The ritual was over. Zixandra found herself standing in the center of the ruined command chamber, surrounded by the debris of her own assumptions. The human emerged from the shadows like a ghost, his simple uniform torn and dirty but his expression calm. You could have killed me, she said, and it wasn't a question. Harrison nodded. Several times. Why didn't you? Because killing you wouldn't have accomplished my mission. You're more valuable as an ally than as a corpse. The War Queen stared at him for a long moment, her compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. The bonding is complete. You have survived the trial. She paused. You have done more than survive. You have impressed me. Harrison gave a slight bow. Thank you, Your Majesty. Do not thank me yet, mate warrior. You have won the right to stand beside me, but you have also earned something else. Her mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. You have earned the attention of the Hive Mothers. The Hive Mothers? The eldest of our kind. The ones who remember the old wars, the old enemies. They will want to meet the soft thing who turned a Kethmori queen into prey in her own nest. Zixandra's claws extended slightly. I hope you are prepared for that conversation, husband. Because if you thought this trial was challenging, you have no idea what awaits you. As they made their way back through the tunnel system toward the upper chambers, Zixandra found herself studying her new mate with growing fascination. She had expected to break him, to prove the superiority of her kind over these upstart mammals. Instead, she'd been given a lesson in the nature of intelligence versus instinct, preparation versus natural ability. The human had turned her greatest strength, her knowledge of the deep chambers, into her greatest weakness. He'd used her own history against her, weaponized her ancestors' victories and defeats alike. What kind of species produced minds capable of that level of strategic thinking? And what did it mean for the galaxy now that humanity had announced itself not as supplicants seeking protection, but as equals demanding recognition? As they emerged into the Queen's chamber, where the assembled delegates waited with barely concealed amazement, Zixandra realized that the bonding ceremony had been about much more than saving the Vorthak or preventing a war. It had been humanity's entrance exam for the galactic community, and they just passed with honors. 3 months after the bonding ceremony, Lyralii found herself aboard the Terran diplomatic vessel Endeavor, watching Earth grow larger through the viewport. The blue marble hanging in space looked deceptively peaceful, its white clouds swirling over continents that showed no signs of the violent history she'd studied. Colonel Harrison had invited her to visit his homeworld as part of the new alliance between the Vorthak Empire and the Terran Coalition. What she hadn't expected was to discover that she wasn't the only alien delegate making this journey. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Kethvar, the Raxtheri xenobiologist whose people had been so devastatingly defeated at Proxima. From this distance, Terra appears to be a garden world. Optimal temperature range, abundant water, stable magnetic field. most curious. Seated beside him was War Master Thex of the Corvin hegemony, a species of militant reptilians who controlled 3-star systems and had never lost a ground engagement. The massive warrior's scaled features showed confusion as he studied the planetary scans. The atmospheric composition is highly unusual, Thex rumbled. 21% oxygen. Most death worlds maintain lower levels to prevent catastrophic combustion events. That's not the strangest part, added Ambassador Velterra of the Sindarin Republic, her crystalline form chiming softly as she spoke. I've been analyzing the geological data. This planet has suffered at least 5 major extinction events in its history, each one wiping out the dominant life forms. Yet life not only survived, but thrived. Lyralii nodded, her scales flickering with unease. The more I learn about Earth, the less I understand how humans developed their particular psychology. By all rights, this planet should have produced either extremely aggressive predators or highly defensive prey species. Instead, it created something that seems to be both. Through the viewport, Earth's moon came into view, its cratered surface bearing testimony to the violence that had shaped the inner solar system during the planet's formation. Even more disturbing were the obvious signs of human habitation, massive orbital installations, mining operations, and what appeared to be military installations carved directly into the lunar rock. They've militarized their satellite, observed Thex with professional interest. Impressive defensive positioning. Any invasion fleet would have to deal with fortified positions on multiple orbital planes. It's not just defensive, Dr. Kethvar said, his 4 eyes studying the tactical displays. Those mass driver installations could accelerate projectiles to significant fractions of light speed. They've turned their moon into a kinetic bombardment platform capable of sterilizing entire continents. The Endeavor's intercom crackled to life, and Captain Sarah Chen's voice filled the observation deck. Honored guests, we're beginning our final approach to Terra Station. Colonel Harrison and War Queen Zixandra will meet you in Docking Bay 7. As their shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, the assembled delegates got their first close look at human civilization. The cities below were unlike anything in their previous experience, sprawling metropolises that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape, while somehow dominating it completely. The 6 months after the Earth delegation's return, the galaxy was a very different place. Word of humanity's true nature had spread through diplomatic channels like wildfire, creating ripples of unease that reached even the most remote corners of civilized space. Ancient powers that had ruled for millennia suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering what these newcomers might do next. Lyralii was in her reconstructed palace on New Thesha when the emergency session of the Galactic Council was called. The message was brief, but urgent. An unknown force had attacked the hegemony of Eternal Dominion, the galaxy's oldest and most powerful empire. The Eternals, who had ruled over 40 star systems for over 10,000 years, were requesting immediate assistance from all member species. The very fact that the Eternals were asking for help was unprecedented. They were the descendants of the predecessors, the ancient race that had seeded the galaxy with faster-than-light technology and established the fundamental laws of interstellar civilization. Their technology was so advanced that most species considered them practically divine. As Lyralii's ship approached the Council station at Nexus Prime, she could see signs of the panic spreading through the galactic community. Military vessels from dozens of species had assembled in a defensive formation around the station, while emergency broadcasts filled the communication channels with fragments of terrifying reports. The eternal homeworld of Dominion Prime had gone dark 6 days ago. The last transmissions from the system showed massive ships emerging from what appeared to be tiers in space-time itself. Ships unlike anything in the galactic databases, composed of what looked like crystallized shadow, and moving in formations that hurt to look at directly. The emergency session was already underway when Lyralii arrived. The great amphitheater buzzed with panicked conversations in hundreds of different languages as representatives tried to make sense of reports that seemed to defy rational explanation. Order. High Magistrate Veltar called, his 4 arms raised for attention. We will hear the testimony of survivor Captain Zethmarin of the Eternal Defense Fleet. The being that approached the central podium bore little resemblance to the proud Eternals that most delegates remembered. Zethmarin's usually pristine robes were torn and stained, his luminous skin flickering weakly, and his multiple eyes showed the hollow stare of someone who had witnessed something beyond comprehension. The first ships appeared 3 cycles ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. They came from nowhere, emerging from what our sensors registered as quantum foam fluctuations. By the time we realized they were artificial constructs, they had already begun their assault on the outer colonies. He activated a holographic display, showing grainy footage of the battle. The assembled delegates watched in horrified silence as sleek vessels of impossible design tore through eternal defenses that had been considered impregnable for millennia. Our plasma cannons had no effect, Zethmarin continued. Our graviton torpedoes passed through their hulls as if they weren't there. Even our reality anchor weapons, which can destroy matter at the quantum level, seemed unable to damage them. Warmaster Thex leaned forward in his seat. What about their weapons? How did they attack you? They didn't use weapons in any sense we understand, the captain replied. Their ships would approach our vessels and drain them. Energy, matter, even the crew's life force. Everything would simply cease to exist, leaving behind only empty husks floating in space. Dr. Kethvar's scientific mind struggled with the implications. That's impossible. Conservation of energy is a fundamental law of physics. Matter and energy cannot simply disappear. Tell that to the 40 billion souls who lived on Dominion Prime, Zethmarin said bitterly. The planet is still there, still orbiting its star. But it's empty. A dead rock with no trace that civilization ever existed on its surface. The chamber erupted in panicked discussions as delegates tried to process this information. The Eternals represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization, possessing technology that bordered on the miraculous. If they could be defeated so easily, what hope did the younger species have? High Magistrate Veltar called for order again. Has anyone been able to establish communication with these entities? Do we know what they want? We received one transmission, Zethmarin replied. It was broadcast on all frequencies as their fleet departed the system. The translation was difficult, but our linguists believe the message was, the harvest begins. The young shall feed the eternal hunger. A chill silence fell over the assembly. Ambassador Velterra of the Sindarin Republic was the first to speak. Harvest. They're talking about harvesting us. All of us. The patterns of their attacks suggest systematic resource gathering, added Dr. Kethvar. They're not conquering territory or establishing colonies. They're consuming everything of value and moving on. It was then that Ambassador Marcus Chun of the Terran Coalition rose to speak. The assembled delegates turned toward him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Humanity had proven themselves capable of impossible victories, but this threat seemed beyond anything they'd faced before. Has the Terran Coalition encountered these entities? Asked Veltar. Not directly, Chun replied. But we've been analyzing the sensor data from the Eternal survivors, and we believe we know what they are. The chamber fell silent. Chun activated his own holographic display, showing tactical analyses and comparative data that made several delegates lean back in alarm. We call them devourers, he said. They're not from this galaxy. Our astrophysicists believe they're extragalactic entities that travel between galaxies, consuming everything in their path before moving on to the next target. How can you possibly know this? Demanded Ambassador Krell. Because we've fought them before. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chun continued, his voice calm and matter-of-fact despite the enormity of what he was revealing. 65 million years ago, the Devourers reached the edge of our galaxy. They consumed the civilization that existed here before us, the ones you call the predecessors. The dinosaur extinction event on Earth wasn't caused by an asteroid impact. It was caused by the gravitational disruptions from the final battle between the predecessors and the Devourers. Dr. Kethvar's 4 eyes widened in shock. That's impossible. The geological evidence clearly shows. The geological evidence shows exactly what you'd expect from a planet caught in the crossfire of a galaxy-spanning war, Chen interrupted. Massive kinetic impacts, global fires, nuclear winter conditions. The predecessors used our solar system as their final fortress, Earth as their last command post. When they fell, they made sure the Devourers paid such a terrible price that they retreated back to dark space to recover. Lyralii felt her scales flush cold with understanding. You're saying humanity evolved on a battlefield. That Earth is the site of the predecessors' last stand. Earth is a war memorial, Chen confirmed. Every fossil we've found, every extinction layer in our geological record, every mass die-off in our planet's history was caused by weapons fire from a war we didn't even know was happening above our heads. The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't evolved on a death world because of natural catastrophes. They'd evolved in the aftermath of the most devastating war in galactic history, shaped by the lingering effects of weapons that had been designed to fight entities from beyond the galaxy itself. The predecessors left behind more than just ruins and technology, Chun continued. They left behind warnings, databases, and contingency plans. Hidden archives that humanity discovered when we first achieved faster-than-light travel. We've spent the last 50 years preparing for this day. War Master Thex leaned forward, his professional interest overriding his fear. Preparing how? By studying predecessor war doctrine and adapting it to current technology. By developing weapons and tactics specifically designed to fight entities that operate outside the normal laws of physics. By building a military infrastructure that can coordinate defense across multiple star systems. Chin's holographic display shifted to show technical schematics that made several delegates gasp in shock. The humans hadn't just been developing conventional weapons. They'd been creating technologies that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of science. Quantum disruptors that can destabilize matter at the subatomic level. Reality anchors that can force extra-dimensional entities back into normal space. Psionic resonance weapons that can disrupt the collective consciousness that seems to control devourer fleets. These weapons. Dr. Kethvar's voice was hollow with shock. Some of these designs are theoretically possible, but would require energy outputs that could power entire star systems. Which is why we've been building Dyson spheres around uninhabited stars, Chin replied casually. We need the energy infrastructure to power the weapons that can actually hurt these things. The chamber erupted in chaos as delegates realized the full implications of what they were hearing. Humanity hadn't just been preparing for conventional warfare. They'd been quietly transforming themselves into the galaxy's defense force against threats that most species couldn't even comprehend. How long? Lyralii asked, her voice cutting through the noise. How long before they reached the core systems? Chin consulted his datapad. Our deep space monitoring stations detected Devourer scout fleets entering the Outer Rim 3 days ago. Based on their previous movement patterns, we estimate they'll reach the major trade routes within 6 months. The core worlds will be under attack within 2 years. High Magistrate Veltar's forearms trembled as he tried to maintain order. What do you propose? How can we possibly defend against entities that destroyed the Eternals so easily? We fight, Chin said simply. But not the way you're used to fighting. Not with honor and rules of engagement and civilized warfare. We fight like humanity fights. Like we've always fought. With everything we have, everything we can think of, everything we can possibly use as a weapon. He gestured to the tactical display, showing the current disposition of human forces throughout the galaxy. The other delegates were shocked to realize just how extensive the human military presence had become in such a short time. We've been positioning supply depots and staging areas throughout the galaxy for the past 6 months. Every human civilian ship is also a military transport. Every human colony is also a fortress. Every human trade station is also a weapons platform. You've been militarizing the entire galaxy without telling us, Veltera observed, her crystalline form flickering with alarm. We've been preparing to save the galaxy without asking your permission, Chin corrected, because we learned from the predecessors' mistakes. They were too civilized, too concerned with minimizing casualties and preserving infrastructure. When you're fighting for the survival of all sentient life, those considerations become luxuries you can't afford. It was then that the chamber's communication system crackled to life with an incoming transmission. The view screen lit up with the familiar figure of Colonel Harrison, but he was no longer wearing his diplomatic uniform. Instead, he stood in what was clearly a military command center, surrounded by banks of tactical displays and human officers coordinating what appeared to be a massive mobilization. Ambassador Chan, Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, we've got confirmation. Long-range sensors are detecting Devourer fleets massing at the galactic edge. Estimated strength, 10,000 ships minimum. They're not scouting anymore. This is the main invasion force. Chin nodded grimly. How long until they reach inhabited systems? 4 weeks. Maybe less. The assembled delegates sat in stunned silence as the reality of their situation sank in. The greatest threat in galactic history was bearing down on them, and their only hope of survival lay with a species they'd barely met, led by individuals they were only beginning to understand. Colonel, Chun continued, what's the status of Project Lazarus? Harrison's expression grew grim. War Queen Zixandra has convinced the Hive Mothers to commit their entire fleet to the defense effort. The Kethmori are mobilizing 1 million bioships for the final battle. Combined with our own forces and whatever allies we can gather, we might have a chance. Lyralii found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to. The Vorthak Empire offers its full support. Our remaining fleets are at your disposal. One by one, other delegates began to voice their commitment. The crisis had stripped away millennia of political posturing and diplomatic maneuvering. When faced with extinction, the only choice was to trust the species that had been quietly preparing for this moment since they'd first reached the stars. Very well, Chen said, his voice carrying the weight of the decision they'd all just made. As of this moment, the Terran Coalition assumes emergency command authority over all allied forces. We're going to war, and we're going to fight it the human way. As the delegates dispersed to contact their respective governments and begin mobilization, Lyralii found herself wondering if they'd just made the right decision or simply chosen the manner of their destruction. But as she watched the human delegation coordinate their response with calm efficiency, she realized something that both terrified and comforted her. For the first time since the crisis began, she wasn't facing extinction alone. Humanity had come to save the galaxy. Whether the galaxy would survive their methods of salvation remained to be seen. The Battle of the Void Gates would be remembered as the day the galaxy learned why gods fear humanity. But in the moments before it began, all Lyralii could see was the impossible scope of the forces arrayed against them. The Devourer fleet hung in space like a wound torn in reality itself. 10,000 ships that seemed to be constructed from crystallized darkness, their hulls absorbing light and heat and hope with equal hunger. They moved in formations that hurt to look at directly, patterns that suggested intelligence operating on scales that mortal minds couldn't fully comprehend. Against them stood the combined fleets of 47 species, nearly 500,000 ships representing every military tradition in the galaxy. It should have been an inspiring sight, but Lyralii knew the numbers were meaningless. The Eternals had possessed technology that could manipulate space-time itself, and they'd been swept aside like dust. All ships, this is Admiral Harrison aboard the TCWS Indomitable. The voice crackled over the fleet communications network. We are about to engage an enemy that has consumed galaxies, an enemy that our ancestors fought and died to contain 65 million years ago. Today, we fight not for glory or conquest, but for the right of sentient life to exist in this universe. Lyralii stood in the command center of the Vorthak flagship Thession's Pride, watching as her tactical displays tried to make sense of the human battle formations. What she saw defied every principle of naval warfare she'd ever learned. Instead of organizing by ship class or species, the humans had integrated their forces into mixed tactical groups that seemed to follow no logical pattern. Admiral, her tactical officer reported, his scales flickering with confusion. The human formations, they're not deploying for a conventional engagement. Their heavy ships are scattered throughout the fleet, their support vessels are acting as frontline units, and their actual warships appear to be holding back in reserve. Before Lyralii could respond, the Devourer fleet began to move. The sight was hypnotic and terrifying, thousands of ships flowing through space like a living organism, pulsing with energies that made reality ripple around them. As they advanced, the very structure of space-time began to warp and twist. All ships, weapons free, Harrison's voice commanded. Remember, conventional weapons won't work against these things. Follow the targeting data we're transmitting and trust your human tactical coordinators. This is going to get very strange, very quickly. The first exchange of fire lit up the void between the two fleets. Plasma cannons and particle beams lanced out from the Allied ships, only to pass harmlessly through the Devourer vessels as if they were fighting ghosts. But the human ships were firing something else entirely, weapons that tore holes in space itself and hurled bolts of what looked like controlled antimatter. By the ancestors, Lyralii's weapons officer whispered, watching as human quantum disruptors began to take effect on the enemy fleet. Those weapons, they're rewriting the laws of physics in local space-time. The Devourers responded with their own assault, and the Allied fleet got its first taste of weapons that operated outside the normal universe. Ships simply stopped existing. Not destroyed, not vaporized, but erased from reality as if they had never been built. Entire squadrons vanished in heartbeats, leaving behind only empty space and the screams of their crews on the emergency channels. But the humans had been expecting this. As the Devourer energy drain weapons reached out to consume more ships, they encountered something unprecedented, vessels specifically designed to be immune to their effects. Lazarus Protocol is active, Harrison announced, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. All ships with predecessor technology upgrades are now immune to Devourer Drain weapons. Phase 2 begins now. What happened next would be analyzed by military historians for centuries. The human ships, retrofitted with technology recovered from predecessor ruins, began to reveal their true capabilities. They weren't just immune to the Devourer weapons. They were designed to turn those weapons against their users. Reality anchor ships, massive vessels that looked more like mobile space stations than warships, activated fields that forced the extra-dimensional Devourers back into normal space-time. Suddenly, beings that had been untouchable became vulnerable to conventional weapons. All Allied forces, concentrate fire on the anchored targets, Harrison ordered. You've got approximately 30 seconds before they adapt to our countermeasures. The combined firepower of 500,000 ships focused on the trapped Devourer vessels, and, for the first time in the battle, alien ships began to die. The sight of Devourer vessels exploding in conventional fireballs sent a cheer through the Allied fleet that could be heard across dozens of communication channels. But the enemy adapted with terrifying speed. Within minutes, they'd modified their approach, sending smaller vessels to attack the reality anchor ships, while their main force began to withdraw to a safe distance. Their learning, observed War Queen Zixandra from her position aboard the Kethmori flagship. Her bioship, the heart of the Deep Hive, was unlike anything else in the fleet, a living vessel the size of a space station, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that spoke to the collective consciousness of 1,000,000 warrior drones. Of course they are, Harrison replied. Which is why we go to Phase 3. The human admiral's next command shocked every non-human commander in the fleet. All civilian vessels, begin your approach runs. Show them what humanity really learned from the predecessors. Lyralii watched in horror as thousands of human merchant ships, colony vessels, and even passenger liners began accelerating toward the Devourer fleet. They were defenseless, carrying no weapons heavier than point defense systems, but they moved with the coordination of a military formation. Are the humans insane? Her tactical officer asked. They're sending unarmed civilians against entities that devour entire star systems. But as the civilian ships approached the enemy line, their true purpose became clear. Each vessel began to broadcast something, a signal that resonated on frequencies that shouldn't have been possible. The space around the Devourer fleet began to ripple and distort as reality itself responded to the transmissions. Psionic resonance weapons. Dr. Kethvar's voice crackled over the communication network from his position aboard the Rax Theory science vessel. They're using the collective consciousness of their entire species as a weapon. The effect on the Devourer fleet was immediate and devastating. Ships that had moved with perfect coordination began to falter and drift. Their formations broke apart as the hive mind that controlled them was disrupted by the psychic assault from millions of human minds, all focused on a single purpose: the complete destruction of their enemies. But the humans weren't finished. As the enemy fleet reeled from the psionic attack, Harrison gave his final order. Project Prometheus is authorized. All Dyson Sphere installations, fire at will. The stars themselves seemed to pulse as hidden installations around distant suns activated. Massive energy beams, powered by the total output of entire solar systems, lanced across light years of space to converge on the Devourer fleet. The beams weren't just energy weapons. They were controlled stellar events, the fury of stars themselves weaponized, and focused by technology that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. The Devourer fleet, caught between psychic disruption and stellar bombardment, began to collapse. Ships that had seemed invulnerable moments before were torn apart by forces that could crack planets. The beings that had devoured the Eternals found themselves facing weapons that operated on scales they hadn't encountered in millions of years. As the enemy formation disintegrated, the Allied fleet pressed their advantage. But it was the Kethmori who delivered the killing blow. War Queen Zixandra's bioships, evolved specifically for close combat, swarmed over the surviving Devourer vessels like antibodies attacking a virus. For the honor of the Deep Hives, Zixandra's battle cry echoed across the fleet communications as her forces engaged the enemy in brutal melee combat. Bioships wrapped around Devourer vessels like living weapons, tearing into hulls that had been weakened by human reality anchor technology. The Battle of the Void Gates lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Devourer invasion fleet had been completely annihilated, their wreckage scattered across a light year of space. Not a single enemy vessel escaped to carry word of their defeat back to the dark spaces between galaxies. But It was the aftermath of the battle that truly showed the galaxy what humanity had become. As rescue operations began for the surviving Allied ships, the human fleet demonstrated a level of organization and efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Medical ships that doubled as mobile hospitals appeared from nowhere to tend to the wounded. Engineering vessels began immediate repairs on damaged Allied ships, using technology that seemed to blur the line between science and magic. Supply ships emerged from hidden depots with replacement parts and ammunition that had been pre-positioned throughout the battle zone. How? Lyralii asked as human technicians swarmed over her damaged flagship, repairing systems that her own engineers said would require months of shipyard work. How did you prepare for all of this? Admiral Harrison, now standing in the Pride's command center after personally overseeing the rescue operations, looked older than his years, but strangely satisfied. Because we had to. Because someone has to be ready for the worst-case scenario. Because that's what humans do. He gestured to the tactical displays showing the cleanup operations. Every species in the galaxy has something they excel at. The Eternals had pure knowledge. The Kethmori have individual martial prowess. The Vordhak have diplomatic sophistication. But humans? We have something else. What? Lyralii asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. We have the ability to envision the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen and then prepare for something even worse than that. Harrison's smile was tired but genuine. We've been getting ready for this fight since before we knew it was coming, because we learned from our planet's history that if you're not prepared for extinction, it will find you anyway. In the days that followed the battle, as the Allied fleets returned to their home systems, and the galaxy began to process what had happened, the true scope of humanity's preparations became clear. They hadn't just been building weapons and training soldiers. They'd been quietly transforming the entire galactic civilization into a fortress capable of defending against threats from beyond the galaxy itself. Trade routes had been redesigned to serve as military supply lines. Civilian infrastructure had been built with military applications in mind. Even cultural exchange programs had been designed to spread human tactical doctrine throughout the galaxy under the guise of diplomatic cooperation. You've been planning this for 50 years, Lyralii accused during a private meeting with Harrison aboard the human diplomatic station. Everything you've done, every alliance you've made, every favor you've granted, it was all preparation for this war. Yes, Harrison admitted without hesitation. And we'll keep preparing for the next one. The next one? Harrison activated a holographic display showing long-range sensor data from the galactic edge. The Devourers we fought were just the advance force. Our deep space monitoring stations are detecting gravitational anomalies that suggest much larger fleets moving between galaxies. This invasion was a test of our defenses. The real war hasn't started yet. Lyralii felt her scales flush cold with the implications. How many more are coming? Unknown. But, based on the energy signatures we're detecting, we estimate at least 50 times the force we just defeated. Harrison's expression was grim, but determined. Which is why we're going to need every species, every ship, every resource the galaxy can provide. He paused, studying the alien ambassador with eyes that had seen too much. We saved your people from the Kethmori because it was the right thing to do. We allied with Zixandra because we recognized a fellow warrior. We shared our technology and our tactics because we needed allies. But make no mistake about our ultimate motivation, which is survival, not just for humanity, but for every sentient being in this galaxy. The Devourers don't just consume matter and energy. They consume the very concept of consciousness itself. If they win, it won't just mean death. It will mean that intelligence itself ceases to exist in this corner of the universe. Lyralii looked out at the stars, knowing that somewhere in the dark spaces between them, forces beyond imagination were preparing for war. But, for the first time since learning about the Devourer threat, she felt something approaching confidence. Because humanity had proven something that every species in the galaxy now understood. When faced with extinction, when confronted with enemies that seemed invincible, when staring into the abyss of cosmic horror, humans didn't despair. They got to work. They planned. They prepared. They adapted. They found ways to turn their enemies' strengths into weaknesses and their own weaknesses into weapons. They fought not with honor or glory or noble purpose, but with a cold, calculating determination to survive and protect those they considered their own. They were exactly the kind of ally the galaxy needed for the war that was coming. And, as word of the Battle of the Void Gates spread throughout civilized space, carried by survivors who had witnessed humanity's true nature revealed in all its terrible glory. A new understanding began to take hold among the stars. The galaxy had found its guardians. Whether it could survive their protection remained to be seen. But, for the first time in millions of years, sentient life in the Milky Way had a chance against the forces that sought to devour it. And, sometimes, a chance was all that humanity needed to achieve the impossible. The war was far from over. But, the galaxy now knew something that even gods had learned to fear. When you threaten humanity's tribe, you don't just face their weapons or their technology or their superior tactics. You face their absolute refusal to accept defeat, no matter the cost. And that, more than any weapon ever devised, was what would save them all in the darkness to come.